In the darkness of Nazi-occupied Europe, ordinary people made extraordinary choices. While millions turned away, thousands risked everything to hide their Jewish neighbors from certain death. But what happened when they were caught? The punishment for hiding Jews wasn't just imprisonment. It was often a death sentence, not just for the protector, but for their entire family. Children, grandparents, everyone. Today, we uncover the brutal reality faced by those who chose humanity over compliance, compassion over safety. These are the forgotten stories of those who said no to genocide and paid the ultimate price. The Nazi regime's approach to those caught sheltering Jews was designed to instill terror. In most occupied territories, the official punishment was death, not just for the individual caught, but often for their entire household. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a calculated policy meant to make the risk of helping Jews so severe that even the most compassionate would think twice. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, declared in Poland, "If anyone helps a Jew, the entire family will be killed." This wasn't an idle threat. The Nazis meticulously documented their enforcement of this policy across occupied Europe. In the Netherlands, the death penalty for hiding Jews was established in 1941, just 1 year into the occupation. While sometimes the punishment was reduced to imprisonment in a concentration camp, this was hardly mercy. It was often simply a slower death. Let's examine specific cases to understand the brutal reality these helpers faced. In the small village of Huta Pieniaka, nestled in eastern Poland, the Garbarczyk family lived a quiet life before the war. Tomasz and Maria Garbarczyk were ordinary farmers with 2 teenage children, Janusz and Helena. They had been well respected in their community for generations. When the Nazi occupation intensified in 1943, the Garbarczyks made a fateful decision after a Jewish acquaintance from the nearby town approached them in desperation. Despite knowing the risks, they converted their root cellar, normally used for storing vegetables through the harsh Polish winters, into a hiding place. What began as temporary shelter for one family gradually expanded to 3 Jewish families, 11 people in total, as conditions worsened for Jews in the region. For months, the Garbarczyks shared their meager rations, brought news from the outside world, and maintained an atmosphere of hope in seemingly hopeless times. Janusz, their 16-year-old son, would later be described by a survivor as keeping watch with the vigilance of someone 3 times his age. But on a bitter, cold February morning in 1944, their world collapsed. A neighbor, possibly motivated by the substantial reward offered for revealing Jewish hideouts, reported unusual activity at the farmhouse. Multiple shadows passing by windows at night, excessive food purchases for a family of 4. German soldiers, accompanied by Ukrainian collaborators, surrounded the property before dawn. The Garbarczyks had no warning, no chance to evacuate those they protected. When soldiers pried open the concealed entrance to the root cellar, the hidden families were discovered immediately. What followed was methodical cruelty. The entire Garbarczyk family, Tomasz, Maria, Janusz, and 14-year-old Helena, were dragged outside alongside the Jewish families they had protected. They were forced to kneel in the snow as the winter wind whipped around them. One by one, they were executed with a single shot to the back of the head, beginning with the youngest child. Tomasz Garbarczyk was killed last, forced to watch his entire family die before him. Their bodies were left exposed in the village center for 3 days as a warning to others who might consider similar acts of humanity. The farmhouse, which had been in the family for 3 generations, was burned to the ground, erasing nearly all evidence that the Garbarczyks had ever existed. Only a distant cousin, who had moved to another village before the war, survived to tell their story years later. Despite these horrific risks, people continued to hide Jews throughout occupied Europe. They created false walls, dug underground bunkers, converted attics, and designed elaborate warning systems. Many developed complex routines to obtain extra food without arousing suspicion, one of the most common ways rescuers were discovered. The story of those who protected Anne Frank and her family represents one of the most documented cases of people who risked their lives to hide Jews. For over 2 years, Victor Kugler, Johannes Kleiman, Miep Gies, and Bep Voskoil maintained an extraordinary deception in the heart of Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. Every day, these 4 ordinary office workers walked a tightrope between normal life and unimaginable risk. They smuggled food rations for 8 people up narrow staircases, obtained black market goods at great personal danger, and maintained an elaborate fiction about the abandoned office space above the workspace. Victor Kugler, whom Anne Frank called Mr. Krahler in her diary, served as the primary business contact for Otto Frank's company. A reserved Austrian-born businessman, Kugler managed the business during the day, while coordinating the complex logistics of keeping 8 people hidden and fed. Johannes Kleiman, a quiet accountant who had worked with Otto Frank since the 1920s, handled financial matters for both the business and the hidden families. His calm demeanor masked the tremendous pressure he faced daily. Miep Gies, an Austrian-born Dutch citizen, became the main supply line for the secret annex, shopping at different stores daily to avoid suspicion about the quantity of food she purchased. She brought books, news, and most importantly, hope to the hidden families. Bep Voskuil, the youngest helper at just 23 when the hiding began, worked as a secretary while helping to maintain the secret annex. Her father helped construct the famous bookcase that concealed the entrance to the hiding place. Their world shattered on August 4, 1944, when the Gestapo arrived at 263 Prinsengracht, following an anonymous tip. The 8 people who had been hidden for 761 days were arrested, along with Kugler and Kleiman. The consequences for the helpers varied dramatically, an unusual circumstance that reveals the sometimes arbitrary nature of Nazi punishment. Kugler and Kleiman were sent to labor camps as enemies of the regime for hiding Jews, while Kleiman was released after 7 weeks due to severe health problems. Kugler endured brutal conditions at multiple camps before escaping during a prisoner transport when Allied forces bombed the train. Miep Gies and Bep Voskuil were initially detained but ultimately released, a remarkable exception to Nazi protocol. Gies attributed her release to the arresting officer being Austrian, like herself. Upon returning to the office, Gies discovered Anne's diary pages scattered on the floor and preserved them without reading them, later giving them to Otto Frank, the sole survivor of the 8 hidden people. This case stands as an exception rather than the rule. In most of Europe, particularly in the East, the helpers rarely survived. The relative leniency shown to Anne Frank's protectors was extremely unusual. While the Amsterdam case represents a rare instance where some helpers survived, Eastern Europe tells a far darker story, one where entire families were exterminated for the crime of compassion. The village of Oborki in western Ukraine presents one of the most harrowing examples of the fate that awaited those caught helping Jews. Before the war, Oborki was home to both Ukrainian and Polish families who had lived alongside a small Jewish community for generations. The Zygalski family, Stefan, Anya, and their 3 children aged 12, 8, and 4, were farmers who owned a modest plot of land at the village edge. Their home was simple: 2 rooms with wooden floors, a kitchen with a large hearth, and a cellar accessed by a trap door beneath the kitchen table. In early 1942, as mass deportations emptied nearby Jewish communities, Dr. Isaac Bergman and his wife Rivka appeared at the Zygalskis' door one night. Dr. Bergman had once treated the Zygalskis' oldest son for pneumonia, refusing payment when he learned of their financial struggles. Stefan Zygalski immediately recognized the debt he owed. With minimal discussion, the family converted their food cellar into a hiding place, concealing the trap door with a heavy rug and the kitchen table. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement stretched into months as the situation for Jews throughout Ukraine deteriorated rapidly. The daily routine became an exercise in vigilance. Anya would signal danger by singing a particular folk song. The children were sworn to absolute secrecy, understanding somehow, despite their youth, that lives depended on their silence. Their oldest son, Petro, stood watch while collecting firewood, developing signals to warn of approaching patrols. This precarious existence continued for nearly a year. Then, in March 1943, increased partisan activity in nearby forests brought a massive German response. Entire villages were searched house by house. When soldiers arrived at the Zygalski farm, everything initially appeared normal, but a vigilant officer noticed fresh breadcrumbs under the table and the slight indentation in the floor where the trapdoor lay. Within moments, the hiding place was discovered. What followed was calculated terror, designed not just to punish the Zygalskis, but to make an example that would resonate throughout the region. The entire Zygalski family, Stefan, Anya, and all 3 children, including 4-year-old Katerina, were marched to the village square along with Dr. Bergman and his wife. There, gallows had been hastily constructed. Witnesses later described how the Germans forced the entire village to watch as nooses were placed around each neck. The children were executed first. Stefan and Anya Zygalski were the last to die, forced to witness their children's deaths before facing their own. A sign in German and Ukrainian was placed beneath the bodies. This is what happens to those who hide Jews. German officers ordered that the bodies remain displayed for a full week, during which time they brought residents from surrounding villages to witness the consequences of defiance. When finally removed, the Zygalskis were denied proper burial. Their bodies were disposed of in an unmarked location, their farm distributed to a local collaborator, and even their family name was ordered erased from local records. The message was unmistakable. Help Jews and you don't just die, you cease to exist. Lithuania, once home to a vibrant Jewish community of more than 200,000 people, saw some of the most severe persecution in Europe. By 1943, most of Lithuania's Jews had already been murdered in mass executions or deported to death camps. Those who remained survived only through the courage of non-Jewish Lithuanians willing to risk everything. The Kozlauskas family lived in a small farming community outside Kaunas. Juozas and Elena Kozlauska had 4 children ranging from 6 to 17 years old. Elena's mother, 82-year-old Gabriela, also lived with them, making their modest farmhouse crowded even before they became rescuers. In late 1942, Juozas encountered Abe Lipman, a former business associate from Kaunas, hiding in the woods with his extended family. They had escaped from the Kaunas ghetto during a deportation action, knowing that transport meant certain death. Without hesitation, Juozas offered shelter. The Kozlauskas' property included a large hay barn set slightly apart from the main house. Over several nights, working only by moonlight, Juozas and his oldest son dug a pit beneath the hay storage area, reinforced it with timber supports, and created a ventilated living space that could hide 6 people. For months, the arrangement worked. Elena would bring food under cover of darkness. Their children stood watch in rotating shifts. The oldest daughter, Maria, learned Hebrew phrases to communicate danger signals. Young Petras, only 6, was taught to play loudly whenever strangers approached, masking any sounds from the barn. Former neighbors, however, had noticed the Lipmans' disappearance from the ghetto coincided with increased activity at the Kozlauskas' farm. In May 1943, Lithuanian auxiliaries serving the Nazi occupation arrived unexpectedly. What followed was described by a neighboring farmer who witnessed the events from nearby woods. The auxiliaries quickly discovered the hiding place after one of them noticed freshly disturbed earth in the barn floor. All 6 members of the Lipman family were dragged out, beaten, and forced to kneel near the barn. The entire Kozlauskas family was then brought from the house. Even Elena's elderly mother was carried outside when she couldn't walk fast enough. The German officer in charge announced their crime: harboring enemies of the Reich. Rather than executing them immediately, the officer ordered his men to lock everyone: the Kozlauskas family, grandmother Gabriela, and all 6 Jewish fugitives, inside the barn. Hay was piled against the wooden walls, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze. Local residents reported hearing screams for nearly 20 minutes as the structure burned. German soldiers prevented anyone from approaching, photographing the inferno as evidence of successful action against Jewish sympathizers. The next day, once the embers had cooled, local collaborators were ordered to dispose of the remains. No proper burial was permitted. The Kozlauskas' property was confiscated, their livestock distributed to compliant neighbors, and official records were altered to show the family had been resettled in Germany for labor, a common fiction used to disguise executions. 3 weeks later, notices appeared throughout the district featuring photographs of the burning barn. The message was clear: this was the price of helping Jews. The risk of hiding Jews didn't come only from German forces. In many occupied territories, local collaborators proved equally dangerous, sometimes even more zealous than their Nazi overseers. Neighbors, motivated by anti-Semitism, fear, opportunism, or the promise of rewards, frequently informed on those hiding Jews. In occupied France, the situation was complex and contradictory. While the official penalty for hiding Jews technically wasn't death, it was deportation to concentration camps, the outcome was often the same. The Vichy government, established in unoccupied France until 1942, frequently cooperated with Nazi deportation orders, even before the Germans took direct control of the entire country. Marcel Hoffmann's story reveals how the occupiers weaponized greed and opportunism to create a society of informers. Hoffmann, a 48-year-old widower, owned a modest but successful watchmaking shop in Paris's 11th arrondissement. His reputation for skilled repairs had built a loyal clientele over 2 decades. When Germany occupied Paris in June 1940, Hoffman witnessed the gradual dispossession of his Jewish neighbors and customers. By 1942, mass arrests and deportations had become common. It was during one such roundup in July, the infamous Vel de Hiv operation, that the Cohen family sought refuge with Hoffman. David Cohen had been Hoffman's supplier of watch components for years. Now he appeared at Hoffman's back door with his wife Rebecca and their teenage sons Daniel and Joseph. Having narrowly escaped the roundup that had ensnared thousands of Parisian Jews, Hoffman's shop included living quarters above and a cellar below. He immediately converted the cellar into a hiding place, concealing the entrance behind storage shelves. For nearly a year, the Cohens remained hidden while Hoffman continued his business, now under the scrutiny of occupation authorities. Henri Dubois, whose failing competing watch shop was across the street, had long envied Hoffman's success. The occupation presented an opportunity. Noticing Hoffman purchasing more food than a single man would need, and occasionally glimpsing movements behind curtains after curfew, Dubois contacted French police collaborating with the Gestapo. On April 14, 1943, Hoffman was arrested along with the Cohen family. French police conducted the initial arrest, transferring them to German custody the following day. All 5 were sent first to Drancy transit camp outside Paris. Hoffman was classified as a friend of Jews, a designation that carried severe consequences. From Drancy, all 5 were deported to Auschwitz on transport convoy number 55 on May 25, 1943. Upon arrival, the Cohen family was immediately sent to the gas chambers. Hoffman, as a non-Jewish prisoner, was assigned to forced labor, where he perished from exhaustion and malnutrition 3 months later, according to camp records discovered after the war. Meanwhile, Henri Dubois received his reward. German occupation authorities transferred ownership of Hoffman's shop to him as payment for information. He also received a portion of the confiscated inventory and tools. After liberation, Dubois was identified as a collaborator by other shopkeepers. In the chaos of post-liberation justice, he received a 5-year prison sentence, but served only 2 before being released in the general amnesty of 1947. He died in 1963, having never expressed remorse for his actions. Of the 5 people he sent to their deaths, no remains or grave markers exist. While Eastern European nations generally saw more severe and consistent punishment for those hiding Jews, Western European countries weren't exempt from brutal reprisals. The intensity of persecution often reflected local command structures and the degree of resistance in a particular region. Belgium presents a striking example of how helper families could be torn apart, even in Western Europe. The Van Dyck family lived in Brussels, where Felix Van Dyck worked as a university professor of literature before the war. His wife Margot taught piano, and they had 2 teenage children, Thomas, 17, and Elise, 15. In 1940, as Germany occupied Belgium and anti-Semitic regulations intensified, 3 Jewish students from Felix's department approached him in desperation. The students, Jakob Rosenthal, Sarah Birnbaum, and David Katz, had been expelled from the university and feared the worsening conditions. The Van Dycks made a decision that would ultimately destroy their family. They converted their spacious attic into a hiding space, concealing the entrance behind a false wall in a linen closet. For nearly 2 years, the 3 students remained hidden, while the Van Dycks maintained an outward appearance of normal life under occupation. The household developed elaborate safety protocols. Thomas acted as lookout, using his bicycle routes to and from school to monitor German patrol patterns. Elise practiced piano at specific times to mask any sounds from the attic. Margot managed the increasingly difficult task of obtaining enough food without arousing suspicion. Their security measures were meticulous, but one variable remained beyond their control: the human element. In November 1943, a postal worker noticed that the Van Dycks regularly received more food ration cards than their officially registered household size warranted. Whether motivated by ideological fervor or simple bureaucratic diligence, he reported the discrepancy to occupation authorities. The Geheime Feldpolizei, German military police, raided the home early on November 17, 1943. The hidden entrance was discovered within hours. What followed was the systematic destruction of the Van Dyke family. Felix and Margot were immediately arrested and separated. Felix was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he was assigned to the stone quarry, notoriously brutal labor that few survived beyond 6 months. Records recovered after the war indicate he died of pneumonia and malnutrition in March 1944, though former prisoners later suggested this was a euphemism for being worked to death. Margot was transported to Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp north of Berlin. There, she endured forced labor in the camp's textile factory, working 14-hour days on minimal rations. According to testimony from survivors who knew her, Margot succumbed to typhus during the epidemic that swept through the camp in early 1945, just months before liberation. Their son Thomas, at 17 considered old enough for labor, was not sent to a concentration camp, but instead conscripted into forced labor in Germany. Assigned to a munitions factory near Leipzig, he worked under dangerous conditions until the Allied bombing campaign intensified. During an air raid in February 1945, the factory was hit. Thomas was among the 200 foreign workers who perished when their sealed shelter received a direct hit. Only 15-year-old Elise was initially spared, placed with a German family for re-education, a program designed to indoctrinate youth from families deemed politically unreliable. Her subsequent fate remains unknown. Her name appears in no post-war registries of survivors or displaced persons. The 3 Jewish students they had protected, Jakob, Sarah, and David, were sent directly to Auschwitz on the next transport from Belgium. According to camp records, none survived the initial selection process. The Van Dyke home was confiscated and reallocated to a German administrative official. Their possessions were inventoried and distributed among various Nazi organizations. Family photographs, books, and personal mementos were destroyed as politically suspect materials. When relatives attempted to claim the property after the war, they discovered virtually nothing remained of the Van Dyke family, neither possessions nor survivors. Their sacrifice, like so many others, nearly vanished from history entirely. Today we remember these forgotten heroes, ordinary people who, in the darkest hours of human history, chose compassion over self-preservation. They remind us that even in the face of systematic evil, the human capacity for good endures. Thank you for joining this exploration of dark parts of history. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to never miss more history documentaries.